The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Big news regarding the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, from last week. Politico reports that top trade officials from the US, Canada, and 10 other Pacific Rim nations fell short of concluding the TPP on Friday. The reason was differences over agricultural, automotive, and pharmaceutical industry negotiations. They do say, quote, significant progress has been made. A quote from U.S. Trade Representative Michael Froman, we're confident that TPP is within reach. We've agreed that we are going to continue to engage intensively with the goal of resolving the outstanding issues. So it's unlikely that last Friday's failure alone is really going to hold back the eventual passage of TPP. But every day that we have a delay, the longer it takes to complete this, the longer it takes to schedule a vote in Congress, the greater chance that TPP will become an issue for 2016. Now, remember that Hillary Clinton, for example, as we reported, 45 times as Secretary of State pushed TPP. But most recently, she said, quote, the president should listen to and work with his allies in Congress, starting with House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, who have expressed their concerns about the impact that a weak agreement would have on our workers. So initially making many dozens as Secretary of State pro-TPP comments, and then saying something that, while not outright anti-TPP, certainly says we should really be thinking carefully about this thing. If this becomes a bigger issue for the 2016 candidates, both on the Republican side and on the Democratic side, it is going to make things very interesting. On the Democratic side, it will be because of this Hillary Clinton situation. We know about Bernie Sanders on TPP. We will be putting Hillary Clinton potentially in a position to be more definitive about it. On the Republican side, I think it'll be interesting because a lot of these Republicans, it's abundantly clear, know almost nothing about TPP. I'm sure that they can very quickly be advised to come up with some talking points about it, but it is also going to be interesting on that side. So as of this failure on Friday, number one, the date of the next meeting was not immediately announced. We know that the TPP, broadly speaking, hugely benefits the banksters. It hugely benefits mega corporations. It hugely benefits pharmaceutical companies, particularly through the very, very overreaching intellectual property and copyright guidelines that TPP would put in place. It does not benefit people. And this is what everybody needs to understand. And I continue to be shocked and entirely appalled, but also not that surprised, given the context of the last 10 or 20 years politically in the United States, that too many people don't even know what TPP is. I was recently with a group of people, some of whom I knew well, some of whom I didn't, and only a couple people in the group had even heard of TPP. Part of that is because corporate media has no real incentive to report about TPP. We can't really expect to hear about it from them. And then part of it is because there is not this sort of sense that something like TPP is the type of thing that people should be protesting, and that could not be further from the truth. TPP is something that will impact so many people in so many countries, in such a great portion of our planet, and we hear very little about it from corporate media. We see very little understanding of it from many of the average U.S. citizens. We're going to continue talking about it. Talk about it to anybody who will listen. People need to be informed about this. David Badash over at the New Civil Rights Movement has a really great article summing up the completely debunked so-called controversy that is the recent Planned Parenthood non-scandal. David Badash writes, the false and debunked claims that Planned Parenthood is selling aborted fetus body parts just got even more debunked. Now, you may have heard about this anti-abortion group, Center for Medical Progress. Over the last few weeks, they put out 3 videos which they claim show Planned Parenthood executives negotiating over the pricing on baby parts. They don't. The videos have been deceptively edited, but the Republican anti-abortion attacks continue. They don't care about what's going on. They want to shut down Planned Parenthood, etc. Now, a lot of journalists and progressive organizations have debunked the videos. They've debunked the false claims from the Center for Media Progress. But we now have a very worthwhile study, proof that Planned Parenthood is not selling baby parts. And it is actually a study that was called for by a Republican. Indiana's far-right extremist governor, Mike Pence, ordered an investigation into Planned Parenthood. He said, quote, "Every Hoosier should be deeply troubled by allegations that Planned Parenthood affiliates are engaged in the trafficking of human remains. If true, this is not only illegal, it is morally reprehensible under federal and state law. The buying or selling of human body parts is a felony. And as governor, I have an obligation to make sure this is not happening in Indiana." Okay, he called for an investigation. The investigation has now been completed. And as the Associated Press reports, Indiana on Thursday cleared Planned Parenthood facilities that perform abortions, because remember, not all of them even perform abortions, have cleared Planned Parenthood facilities that perform abortions in the state of any wrongdoing in the handling of fetal tissue. The Indiana Department of Public Health said in a statement Thursday that the investigation found no evidence of any laws being broken. Therefore, no deficiencies were cited. Did you hear about this? Did you hear about this on corporate media? This is getting almost no attention in the echo chamber of anti-abortion, Republican-fueled corporate media hysteria. That is really the point, right? You create a false narrative. In this case, it's, wow, they're haggling over the price of aborted body parts. They create a false narrative, which is just eaten up by the base, right? The anti-choice right-wing base just absolutely loves it. They won't really fact check it. And then you have a study here which very clearly says, wait a second, a Republican called for an investigation. They did the investigation and it turned up nothing. We're not even going to mention that. We're not even going to hear about that. We'll keep playing the debunked videos of the haggling over body parts. Let's also remember, and this is just to put a final point broadly, let's step back for a second. Abortion services are a tiny, tiny percentage of what Planned Parenthood does. Most of what Planned Parenthood does is the type of service that evidence-based research tells us helps to reduce the transmission of sexually transmitted infections, STDs, call them what you will, helps to reduce the number of unwanted pregnancies. What's one of the best ways to reduce the number of abortions? Reduce the number of unwanted and accidental pregnancies. That is the best way. That is most of what Planned Parenthood does. You won't hear that from the hysterical, entirely unhinged right-wing echo chamber. Just keep that in mind and remember that this study is out there. Thom Hartmann, our good buddy Thom Hartmann, interviewed former President Jimmy Carter last week and asked him about the current state of politics in the United States. Jimmy Carter was very direct in addressing the state of American politics and made it clear, as we've said before, as a Princeton study has said before, that we don't really have a democracy in the United States anymore. We essentially have an oligarchy. Here is Jimmy Carter, a former president, calling out broadly, systemically, the status quo of what we have in the United States. Take a look.
Political principles, for example, our Supreme Court has now said, unlimited money in politics. It seems a violation of principles of democracy. In the minute or so we have left, your thoughts on that?
It violates the essence of what made America a great country in its political system. Now it's just an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery being the essence of getting the nominations for president or the elected president. And the same thing applies to governors and U.S. senators and Congress members. So now we've just seen a complete subversion of our political system as a payoff to major contributors who want and expect and sometimes get favors for themselves after the election's over.
Yeah. This is just huge. A former president indicting the broad reality of our modern political system. The entire system has become a sort of mockery of democracy. we're going to pretend it's a democracy. People can go and vote. If Republicans don't manage to pass voter suppression laws that make it hard for them to do that, you can donate your money, right? You can donate your money, your $25 to your candidate. Doesn't matter, because now we've raised the limits above the $123,000. That was already a limit that very few donors were even reaching. You can donate whatever you want now. Money is now considered speech. If you can't donate whatever you want to political candidates, your free speech rights are somehow being suppressed. And we have that Princeton study that I mentioned, which says if you look at the legislative desires of like the average person, right? So you listening to me now, you have some goals that you would like to see your elected officials do. And then rich people, the very rich, have goals that they would like to see passed legislatively. And then lobbyists have their set of goals. And then big corporations have their set of goals. The goals, the desires of the big corporations, the very rich and the lobbyists are statistically much more likely to eventually become the law than the legislative desires of you, the average middle-class voter. Now, you could say, you could make an argument that lobbyists and corporations and rich people are just much better at knowing what would be good in terms of legislative ideals. And I would challenge you to find any evidence that suggests that, and you will not be able to. So we know from that Princeton study and from others, from the fact that 84% of the time the candidate who raises more money wins, we know that we don't really have a democracy here. We have an oligarchy. Thom Hartmann has been pointing it out. Princeton has been pointing it out. And now a former president, Jimmy Carter, believe what you will about Jimmy Carter and his legislative accomplishments as president, he is right. Prove to me that Jimmy Carter is wrong if you can. You can follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/dpacman. Producer Lewis is also on Twitter, twitter.com/LewisMotomedy.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Our program is mostly funded by members through the David Pakman Show membership program. Today's new member of the day is Juan Molina. Juan, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. Juan gets the bonus show, the commercial-free audio and video feeds of the show, and of course, he will be invited to our upcoming David Pakman Show member town hall, where Lewis and I answer questions from the audience. Anything is on the table. You can sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. You may notice, by the way, Lewis is not on today's show. He is driving back from Austin to Massachusetts for the upcoming move of the show to Boston, and we're actually going to call him on the bonus show. He will be checking in from the road, and it should be very, very interesting to hear where he has been and where he will be. Remember that if you ever shop on Amazon.com, the shopping you do can support our program. Go to our website, davidpakman.com, and on the right side of the page, you'll see that there's a banner that links to Amazon. Click that, and then use it whenever you shop. I recommend bookmarking the link. Couple of interesting items purchased by our audience over the last week. One is a book called Exploring Calvin and Hobbes, an exhibition catalog paperback. I love Calvin and Hobbes, and I remember when I was maybe 15, I don't remember exactly, and this big 3-volume hardcover Calvin and Hobbes compilation came out of all Calvin and Hobbes cartoons. I got it as a gift, maybe for Hanukkah one year or something like that, and I still have it. I still have it like in my adult bookcase. I'm 31 years old now. It's quite stunning, in fact. But I just have always loved Calvin and Hobbes, and a lot of Calvin and Hobbes stuff over the years has been purchased by our audience. Also, more and more people buying GoPro cameras. I actually see a lot of bicyclists around town with the helmet-mounted GoPros. If you're doing something cool with the GoPros that people have been buying from through our Amazon link, let us know. I'm curious what cool stuff people are up to with that. Remember, davidpakman.com, the Amazon banner, click it, bookmark it, and then use it whenever you shop. Okay, we've talked several times now that once the David Pakman Show moves to Boston, one of the things that we're going to be doing is adding new programming. So there's going to continue being the David Pakman Show, where I will be the host. We will ideally be hiring additional hosts to start with, probably just one. And those hosts will be doing essentially three things. One is starting to produce additional ancillary content for what we are doing. Number two, working on some investigative journalism pieces. And then number three, starting to fill in for me when we have travel days or when we're on vacation or whatever. Right now, the show stops. And as you know, there's just no new programming during that time. The ideal thing would be that we can start operating in a more professional way when I'm not here, someone else is. So in the context of all this, we do need to come up with some name that goes above and beyond. It's sort of a higher order name to the David Pakman Show. And I said this last week or the week before. I said, if you have ideas for what this sort of mini network should be called, please let us know. I have a bunch of suggestions that have been sent in, some better than others. And I think the people who sent them in recognize that. I'll read some of them to you. I don't know that the right name is in this list, but hopefully this will stir up some ideas for you. And then please email us or tweet me or comment on the YouTube clip or whatever with more ideas for what this network should be called. Now, I'll remind you, first, my idea was maybe it should just be TDPN, kind of like ESPN, the sports channel. At one point, it had a meaning like excellence in sports. It might be Excellence in Sports Programming Network. It's not even that easy to say. But in any case, nobody even knows what it is. It's just ESPN. So maybe TDPN, the David Pakman Network, would be a good option. It doesn't even really have to have any meaning. It can be just TDPN. Here are some of the other ideas that were suggested. The Progressive Angle Network, Secular Progress Network, Independent Media Matters, the Progressive Source Network, Progressive News Now, which could be PNN, News and Progressive Views, the Political Overview Network, IMDN, which could stand for the Independent Media Democratic Network, News Pack or PackView, or the PackView Network, PVN, the PragView Network, Prag for pragmatic, Pragnet News, which could also be PNN, PackNet News, which could also be PNN, the Objective Media Network, which could be OBN, and then again, like I mentioned, there is TDPN. So I'll tell you the ones I don't like. I don't think that the word secular should be in it because it's the name should be as general as possible while still having some meaning. And who knows, I would be very open to having a host who is religious, not secular, as long as they understand that there should be total separation of church and state and that their religious views should not be a factor when we think about civil society. So I don't know that I like the word secular in there. Now, Independent Media Matters, it's too close to just Media Matters, which is another organization. I don't think that that's good. Anything with the word democratic, there can be confusion between whether we mean democratic as in of a democracy or democratic as in of the Democratic Party. I'm not a Democrat. Lewis is not a Democrat. Who knows whether the other people we hire will be Democrats? We criticize Democrats all the time. So I don't think that that's a good word there either. So send me your other thoughts. It could be something that makes sense when we say the entire name, like, for example, the PackView Network. Maybe that's where it needs to make sense. But also, if the initials sound good, like PVN, maybe PVN is a good name. I don't know. As you can probably tell, I'm not very good at this, so we are sourcing any and all ideas that you may have. Get in touch, and we'll come up with some short list, and we will probably put it to an audience vote. We'll set up a poll at davidpakman.com. Let's talk about North Korea a little bit. The leader of the North Korean regime, Kim Jong-Un, claimed that he is getting ready to go to war with the United States and what he describes as the puppet South Korean regime. He made this statement during Air Force drills, which he said were part of the preparation for war with the United States. He said the entire thing was intended to, quote, bring about a radical turn in the drills to round off preparations for a war full of the will to settle with arms, accounts with the U.S. imperialists, the chieftain of aggression, and the South Korean puppet group keen to escalate the confrontation with the fellow countrymen and that of social systems seized with sycophancy towards the U.S. That is a mouthful, if I've ever heard one before. Kim Jong-Un claiming he is absolutely ready to go to war with the United States. He says, gone forever is the era when the United States blackmailed us with nukes. Now the U.S. is no longer a source of threat and fear for us, and we are the very source of fear for it. I think what's going on here is that things are not going well with regard to resources in North Korea. By many accounts, agriculture it's already almost at a complete standstill. Within the next 10 years, agriculture could come to a total standstill in North Korea. Coincidentally or not, this news comes just weeks after news broke that North Korea is facing one of the worst droughts in 100 years. Historically, when North Korea has economic or agricultural trouble, they'll threaten war, right? Countries will then help them out with their problems. They'll provide food, they'll provide supplies, and all of a sudden, North Korea doesn't want to go to war anymore. And then, of course, North Korea will spin this to their citizens saying, look, we threatened war with all the countries, or with a bunch of countries, and then those countries gave us gifts. They just were begging us not to go through with it because they're scared of us. We're just the best. And you might say, well, why bother? Why bother giving North Korea anything after they threaten war? If North Korea falls, we could have a sort of warlord style situation where things get even worse for the North Koreans. And we have a ton of treaties with South Korea promising aid in case North Korea ever does certain things. This includes economic treaties. So there would be a chain of events that could happen if the situation in North Korea goes, what would be the term for it? Feral? I don't even know what to describe it. If things completely fall apart, even worse in North Korea. So there are a number of reasons why this would happen. I think that more than likely, this is indeed nothing more than the sort of combination of belligerent rantings and a thinly veiled attempt to draw in more aid. And I agree with some of the logic of why it makes sense to prevent North Korea from completely falling apart. It would be, if it's hard to imagine this, but it would be even worse for the average individual in North Korea. But we will continue to see what happens. As producer Lewis has said before, and maybe we'll ask him about this when we check in with him on the bonus show from the road, Lewis has said he would indeed lead a military coup of North Korea if he could. What do you think the U.S. should do with regard to North Korea? It's a true humanitarian crisis. And we've heard so many times from the U.S. when it comes to foreign policy that a humanitarian crisis was the reason for going into country A, B, or C. It just so happened that country A, B, or C generally also had a resource that we wanted or was advantageous to secure. Not the case in North Korea. Almost no resources there that would be of any value, even to them, never mind to us, and not taking action there. So a lot of people pointing that out to me in the email lately, and I'm curious to see what your thoughts are. After the break, Dr. Aubrey De Grey will join me again to talk about curing the problem of aging. That is next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined once again by Dr. Aubrey De Grey, who's a biomedical gerontologist and chief science officer of the SENS Research Foundation, one of the foremost researchers in the field of solving the problem of aging. He's been on 60 Minutes, he's given a TED Talk, and so many other great things. It's so great to have you on. You know, I want to talk to you more generally about what is new in your field and how your research has been going. But first, I wanted to talk about a recent study which claims to have found that some people age up to 3 times faster than others. And I wanted to see what your thoughts were on this study and tell us what that means when to say that someone ages faster than someone else.
Well, first of all, David, let me thank you for having me back. It's always a great pleasure to be here. So, yes, this study is very innovative and really quite intriguing. I think it's first important to emphasize that it is quite preliminary. It looks at the rate of aging during early adulthood, during one's 20s and 30s. And that means that it doesn't necessarily say too much about what happens later in life. Also, the particular way in which in New Zealand measured the rate of aging is, it's reasonable, but it's not the only way that you could make that measurement. So there are lots of other ideas out there for how to do the same kind of study in a different way, and we need to see that done. We need replication of this. Of course, we also need to see replication in other populations to see whether the variation that is seen in this study can be found in other populations too. But leaving all that aside for the moment, the general principle that some people age more slowly than others is a fascinating idea, and actually it's somewhat counterintuitive. It's not really what people like myself who work on the biology of aging would have expected, both because of the lack of prior information on the subject and also because of the data that has existed with regard to the end of life, the actual age at which people die. There's a very famous concept called the mortality rate doubling time, which basically expresses how rapidly people get into a bad state of health that is likely to kill them as they get older. And that thing seems to be extraordinarily constant across populations. It's the same in long-lived populations and also in short-lived populations. And the ostensible message of this study is that that's actually not the whole story, that there really is a lot of difference out there that is being in some way concealed by population studies which aggregate a lot of individuals together. So that's really the main reason why this study is so fascinating.
And, sort of, it's kind of assumed when we talk about how old people are, we're just subtracting the current date from the date when someone was born, and that's sort of how old people are. But tell us, since you researched this, is there a better way to measure how old someone is? In other words, when you talked about there would be other ways to determine what the real age of someone is for this study, what would that be?
Well, there are lots of different ways of going about it. So this study looked at function. It looked at what people can do and how fast they can run, how tightly they can grip things, and so on. Another thing you can do is look at the people at the molecular level. You can ask things like, how rapidly is their DNA changing in terms of the way in which it decides which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off? And actually, that's quite a high-profile topic right now, too, because in the past couple of years, there have been studies showing this kind of thing, looking at the way in which certain parts of our genome change in that regard during life. And again, these studies are very novel, very preliminary, but they again indicate ways in which we might be able to identify people who are aging more rapidly and less rapidly. So, of course, what this says is that one thing that could be done now, even with a small study, would be to compare those two things, to look at the same population at the functional level and also at the molecular level and see whether there's a correlation. If there is a correlation, then it says that we're really onto something. If there's no correlation, it says that we need a better design of the experiment.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about the most recent developments in your research and in your field. We're starting to read more and more so-called predictions from self-described futurists, and this includes everybody from people like Ray Kurzweil and many others with regard to when they believe that certain milestones will be possible. So one that seems to be popular in some circles is the sort of digitization of the mind and then the potential doing of something with it, whether it's putting it in another body or living in a sort of computer state or whatever. You're working more in a very specific capacity on curing what you call the disease of aging. So what milestones do you look at to evaluate where we are in that?
Well, first of all, let me slightly correct you. I don't really like the phrase the disease of aging. I do believe that aging is a phenomenon that can be amenable in principle to medical intervention.
Okay.
But calling it a disease is a little risky.
So can we call it curing the condition of aging?
That's better.
Okay.
The other thing is that aging is not just one thing. Aging is this collection of interacting but nevertheless somewhat independent phenomena of accumulation of damage that we are subject to and that eventually lead to the diseases and disabilities of old age. So it's a slippery concept. I just wanted to make sure that one didn't get too simplistic there.
Fair enough.
But anyway, to come back to your question, I think it's great that there is so much research going on into what we might call non-biological solutions to the problem of age-related ill health. The idea of uploading, it's not nearly as crazy as it sounds at first sight. It's very, very, very ambitious, and I believe that it's considerably more ambitious and considerably further away than the work we do, even though the work we do is already plenty ambitious. But still, I might be wrong, and I would love for any solution that saves lives to actually work. So I'm all for that research. But what we're doing, yes, our research is moving forward. It's not moving forward nearly as rapidly as we would like, and then really the only reason for that is money. The fact that this work is still quite controversial, quite poorly, its credibility is still limited in many uninformed circles, and of course most people who have serious amounts of money to allocate are relatively uninformed. So that's a shame. But the fact is we are making progress. We're publishing more and more of our interim and ongoing proof of concept results. A lot of our work is now moving into the private sector, being snapped up by startup companies that are interested in the tech transfer opportunity. So that's a good sign, because our stated mission has always been to create and to kickstart a rejuvenation biotechnology industry, operative word being industry. So that's all great. But at the same time, it's always frustrating that we know that we could go perhaps 3 times faster if we just had better funding.
And let's talk a little bit about that. I know that you have launched you are launching a campaign to, it's a mitochondrial mutation project at lifespan.io. And it is sort of like a Kickstarter in a sense. And talk to us about that. What are mitochondrial mutations, and what is their place in the research you're doing?
So mitochondrial mutations are one of the 7 big categories of damage that constitute the SENS research agenda. And we have a particular approach to dealing with them. We've been pursuing that approach for several years already, and we are a lot closer than anyone else has ever been to making this approach work, but it's really difficult. And therefore, it's going to take a long time to get it to work. The reason why nobody else is really working on it is because it's so difficult, and other people have different priorities. They're more interested in getting publications or making profits than they are in doing the best work in the long run. So it falls to us to get this done. And yes, we have started this campaign, as you say. It's not to fund the entire project by any means. It's a big project, but it's to fund a particular part of it. We're trying everything we can to get money in the door. Kickstarter-like campaigns of this nature are a part of that. Of course, we appeal constantly to the general public to simply give us money directly, whether it be high net worth individuals or people with any level of net worth. So, every dollar counts.
Do you get the sense that in your field there is less sort of piggybacking on the prior research that has been done than in other fields? Or do you think that the different organizations and individuals working in your field are doing a good job of working with what has been done and pushing it a little further down the road?
That's actually a pretty difficult question to answer. In a way, the SENS program was an attempt to improve that thing, to actually get the work on the biology of aging and on delaying the ill health of old age to leverage other work better than it had previously had. But that was an unusual case in the sense that what I did was I went out and identified work in completely different fields, in some cases not even medical fields, that I realized could be relevant to the biology of aging when other people had not realized that. So, that's a bit unusual. If we look at the situation now, where SENS is quite a mature concept, and it's been basically the same thing for a long time now, most people who study the biology of aging have at least a crude understanding of what we're trying to do and why it makes some kind of sense. And yes, we certainly are very much focused on listening to each other and making the most of each other's discoveries.
Fantastic. All right, so let me remind everybody, lifespan.io is where you can read about the campaign to fund the Mitochondrial Mutations Project. We've been speaking with Dr. Aubrey De Grey. Always a pleasure having you on.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Big news from MSNBC. Cable news channel MSNBC has canceled 3 shows. These shows are The Cycle, Now with Alex Wagner, and The Ed Show. So there was a memo released by MSNBC President Phil Griffin confirming that these shows are all going off the air. Ed Schultz, Crystal Ball, Toure, and Abby Huntsman are all out the door. Ari Melber and Alex Wagner will stay with MSNBC. Phil Griffin saying in the coming weeks, as we complete our plans to create a new look and flow for our dayside programming, our 3 to 6 p.m. Eastern hours will begin the pivot towards live breaking news coverage with interim hosts from our very talented ranks. In September, we will unveil a 9 to 5 schedule driven by dynamic coverage of breaking news events shaping the day. Chuck Todd is going to anchor a show in the 5 p.m. slot. How lovely. So listen, for years, I've been saying MSNBC is not going to be the vehicle for progressive ideas, and that is abundantly clear now. For a long time, we saw MSNBC editorially taking a more progressive approach, whereas Fox News, as a corporate media outlet, is and continues to take a more right-wing approach. But I don't think that long-term, the format and the style of MSNBC is really the right place for the delivery of true progressive ideas. And this is not a crafted opportunity to promote shows like ours. This is just the reality, right? The future of progressive media is not in the corporate news status quo of MSNBC. We need to be funding independent shows. We just happened to crowdfund $52,000, and we have brought in 3 new investors, and we have a plan. And nowhere in the plan is the possibility of me coming on. Can you imagine if I go on the air one day and I say, listen, the progressive stuff, we're going to start shifting away from the progressive stuff a little bit, and we're going to start doing so-called breaking news coverage, and we're going to bring in some interim hosts. No, this is a progressive show. It's independently funded. It doesn't matter. We have very few advertisers, and it doesn't matter what they say with regard to editorial content. We make it very clear to our advertisers that they have no editorial control over our show whatsoever. This is what we're doing. And the better funded that we are, and shows like ours, I'm not talking just about our show, the better and more extensive our coverage and the sort of dissemination of real progressive ideas is going to be. You're not hearing from corporate media about TPP by and large. You're not hearing from corporate media about the reality that not communism and socialism, but more socialistic ideals are increasingly popular with Americans, and we should talk about balanced capitalism, right? That's an idea that you're not going to hear on corporate news, but it's an idea that resonates with many Americans. Why don't we hear it? Well, a bunch of reasons, and we've talked about it. Primarily, it comes down to money and ratings and corporate influence and political influence. Remember when Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks was on MSNBC, and he revealed that he was talked to, and they said, listen, we're progressive and everything, but you need to kind of damp down the criticism of the Obama administration because the White House is not thrilled. And that's an example of how you can say we're liberal, or you can not say it, but just show it via your programming, but you're still very establishment. It's liberal within very certain parameters where you can't really be criticizing the Obama administration too much. So no surprise at all that this is happening at MSNBC. I'm not happy about it. It's just a reality. And we've been saying this for so long, and increasingly it's becoming the reality, right? This is just what it is. MSNBC is not the vehicle for exploring real progressive ideas. Let's talk about Mike Huckabee. Republican presidential candidate Mike Huckabee, and former Arkansas governor and a Christian pastor, told supporters in Iowa a few days ago that if he were elected president, he would consider using the FBI or National Guard to end abortion by force. According to the Topeka Capital Journal, quote, "I will not pretend there is nothing we can do to stop this." At his next stop in Rockwell City, Iowa, Huckabee answered follow-up questions saying all American citizens should be protected. And then he was asked whether he would stop abortion by using the FBI or federal forces. And he said, "We'll see if I get to be president." Now, you might be saying, David, hold on a second. He didn't say, yes, I would use troops or the FBI to stop abortion. Well, he was asked whether he would, and he didn't say what should be the obvious answer, which is, well, no. The president can't just willy-nilly activate soldiers to stop legal medical procedures. I thought that the right loved the Constitution. This is like saying, well, because of my personal religious beliefs, I'm going to, as president, direct the National Guard to go into hospitals and stop the administration of antibiotics or birth control. This is insanity. Abortion may be more controversial than antibiotics or birth control, but it is a legal medical procedure. And the president, a would-be president, not laughing it off and saying, of course I wouldn't just decide unilaterally to send in troops to stop a legal procedure. Anything short of that makes me question whether they even really know what foundations our country is built upon. The right to an abortion has been upheld by the Supreme Court. Huckabee is saying he might simply disregard the judicial branch altogether and stop the practice unilaterally, removing all checks and balances. This is exactly the type of government tyranny that the pro-gun right claims it needs guns to defend itself from, but it's coming from their own side. The unilateral use of soldiers to stop a legal medical procedure is the closest thing to government tyranny that I can think of, and the pro-gun right is only focused on what people like Obama would do. These people are dangerous. These people are really, really dangerous. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. You can call any time of day. Here's an interesting voicemail. This is an idea somebody had, combining, number one, my trip to Israel. Number two, the idea that Lewis and I are not only gay, but in a relationship with each other. And number three, just general disdain for our program. Let's take a listen.
Yeah. I think you should move back to Israel instead of moving to Boston.
Well, let me stop there. Move back to Israel? I never lived in Israel. Neither did Lewis. But let's continue to listen.
And that way you and your little friend there can be gay together. So adios when you move, and make a different website for somebody else to put a more logical type radio TV on your website, and that way you guys can be together, and homos and Jews, and maybe you'll take
yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe we'll do something that you couldn't quite come up with. I don't need to respond to this, but this is just a sampling of the stuff we get every single day. On the bonus show today, women scam ISIS fighters by posing as potential brides. We will check in with producer Lewis, who was noticeably absent from today's show. He's on the road, driving back to Massachusetts. We'll check in with him and see where he is. davidpakman.com/membership. Do not miss today's bonus show. It is the best way to support the work we're doing. We're talking about pennies a day, and the membership benefits are quite extensive, I must say. Talk to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.